was going to give them 100%. And I did give them 100% every night that I worked, but they really were a bunch of stupid idiots. And I can't even describe how stupid they were.
He was the Hitman, wrestling's perfect machine of precision, pride, and pain. From glory in the ring to betrayal in Montreal and a curse that shattered his family, Bret Hart's story reads like tragedy, scripted by fate itself. But what if his greatest opponent was never another wrestler? The rise and the betrayal. The lights in the arena flickered like lightning on steel. A sea of pink and black sunglasses shimmered under the glare of the spotlights, and every heartbeat in that crowd pulsed to the same rhythm. Hitman! Hitman! It was 1997, and Bret, the Hitman Hart, wasn't just a wrestler. He was Canada's living superhero, the clean-cut technician who fought with precision, pride, and poetry. But behind the quiet confidence of the excellence of execution, the gears of betrayal were already grinding into motion. What happened next would not just end his career, it would change wrestling forever. Bret Hart's story didn't begin under the bright lights of the WWF, but deep beneath the Hart family mansion in Calgary, in a place known only as the Dungeon. It was there that Stu Hart, Bret's father, broke bones and built champions. Bret would later call it a dungeon of pain and pride. From a young age, he was molded by iron discipline. His childhood wasn't filled with toys and cartoons. It was filled with suplexes, submission holds, and the echo of screams from his father's trainees. Stu was a legend himself, a promoter, trainer, and patriarch of a dynasty that would go on to shape wrestling's golden age, and it was his entire life.
Everything I did in my career, I mean, my family, wrestling's not just something that I started doing in my teens. I mean, I think all my life, I was always tied in with wrestling. Everything was wrestling.
When Bret first entered the ring professionally in 1978, working for his father's Stampede Wrestling, there was no guarantee of superstardom. He was quiet, introverted, and technical, a far cry from the flamboyant charisma of Hulk Hogan or Macho Man Randy Savage. But in the world of wrestling, timing is everything. By the mid-1980s, Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation was expanding globally, and Bret, with his pink and black tights and relentless focus, stood out in a company that was drowning in gimmicks. Alongside his brother-in-law, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, he formed the Hart Foundation, a tag team that brought precision to chaos, discipline to spectacle, and realism to an industry built on illusion. Their devastating double-team finisher, the Heart Attack, became an instant trademark. The team's success was meteoric. They captured the WWF Tag Team Championships twice, defeated legends like the British Bulldogs and Demolition, and became one of the Federation's most respected duos. By 1991, Bret had proven himself ready to step out on his own. He broke free from the tag division and began carving out one of the most respected singles careers in wrestling history. His matches against Mr. Perfect, Roddy Piper, and the British Bulldog weren't just fights, they were masterclasses. Critics called him the best technical wrestler alive. As Dave Meltzer wrote in 1992, Bret made the Intercontinental title mean more than the heavyweight championship itself. From there, he rose to the very top. By 1992, Bret Hart was WWF champion, defeating Ric Flair in a small arena in Saskatoon, Canada, a victory that would mark the beginning of his reign as the face of the company's new generation era. The WWF was struggling financially, with Hulk Hogan stepping away amid steroid scandals and fan fatigue. Hart became the Federation's backbone. He didn't have the muscles of a comic book hero, but his storytelling was second to none. Every move he made in the ring looked real. Every match had meaning. Vince McMahon once told him, "You're the guy now." And for the next 5 years, Bret carried the company on his back. He was loved across the world, especially in Canada and Europe, where fans treated him like royalty. From sold-out shows in Toronto's Sky Dome to standing ovations in Wembley Stadium, Bret wasn't just a performer. He was a symbol of integrity in a business often clouded by ego. He didn't cheat. He didn't lie. He wrestled. And that's what made what happened next so gut-wrenching. By 1997, the wrestling world was changing. WCW, the rival promotion bankrolled by Ted Turner, had launched an all-out war with WWF. Bret, once Vince McMahon's golden boy, was caught in the middle. He was still the champion, still adored by millions. But behind the curtain, everything was collapsing. His contract with the WWF was expiring, and McMahon, facing financial strain, couldn't afford to keep him at his $1.5 million salary. So reluctantly, Bret signed a 3-year, $9 million deal with WCW, with McMahon's blessing. He agreed to finish his final weeks in WWF on good terms until one match changed history forever. The date was November 9th, 1997. The event, Survivor Series in Montreal, Quebec. Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels, a man he openly despised. Their real-life feud had grown toxic, fueled by backstage politics, jealousy, and national pride. Bret was the Canadian hero. Shawn was the cocky American rebel. Tensions had spilled far beyond the ring. As Bret would later admit in Wrestling with Shadows, their rivalry had become personal, poisonous, and unforgivable. The storyline was supposed to end with dignity, or so Bret thought. In a private meeting that afternoon, Bret suggested a simple disqualification finish, allowing him to forfeit the title later without embarrassment in front of his home crowd. Vince McMahon agreed, or at least pretended to. What Bret didn't know was that Vince, Michaels, and a handful of WWF insiders were already plotting to betray him live on pay-per-view. Bret himself blamed fellow stars for what happened.
I think Hulk Hogan was pulling the strings on Eric Bischoff like a puppet, and he was such a piece of really.
That night, more than 20,000 fans filled Montreal's Bell Centre, waving Canadian flags and chanting Bret's name. The match itself was brutal, technical, and emotional, a fight that blurred the line between fiction and reality. Bret carried Shawn through each sequence, selling every move with surgical precision. Then, with barely a minute left, the unthinkable happened. Shawn Michaels suddenly locked Bret into his own finishing move, the sharpshooter. Bret reversed it perfectly. That was the plan. But as he transitioned out of the hold, referee Earl Hebner, acting on direct orders from McMahon, signaled for the bell. The match was over. Bret had never tapped out. The crowd erupted in confusion, then rage, and in that instant, Bret Hart realized what had just happened. He had been double-crossed. The words echoed through the arena, through history, through the heart of every fan who ever believed wrestling's unwritten code of respect. Bret spat directly into Vince McMahon's face, smashing monitors at ringside before tracing the letters WCW in the air with his finger. Cameras cut away. The show ended abruptly, but backstage, chaos reigned. According to Earl Hebner's shoot interview, he was told minutes before the match that if he didn't ring the bell, he'd be fired. McMahon had assembled a secret team, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and producer Gerald Briscoe, to execute the betrayal. Even some referees and cameramen weren't informed. It was one of the most cold-blooded decisions in wrestling history, wrote Sports Illustrated. When Bret stormed into the locker room, Vince followed him in. Without warning, Bret threw a single punch that knocked McMahon out cold. According to Bruce Pritchard's Something to Wrestle podcast, McMahon suffered a concussion and a swollen ankle when he hit the floor. Wrestlers like Mick Foley threatened to quit in protest. The locker room split down the middle, half blaming McMahon for betrayal, half blaming Bret for refusing to drop the title. But for Bret Hart, the damage was irreversible. The Montreal Screwjob wasn't just a wrestling controversy, it was the death of trust. It turned Vince McMahon into the villainous Mr. McMahon character that would dominate the Attitude Era, fueling the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and ironically, saving WWF's ratings. But for Bret, it destroyed everything he believed wrestling stood for. In Wrestling with Shadows, filmed before and after that night, he said, "I gave Vince my life, and he sold me out on pay-per-view." That night, Bret left the company he'd helped build. He didn't even pack his gear. He walked straight out of the Bell Center, silent, betrayed, and visibly broken. His 14-year career in WWF had ended not with applause, but with humiliation. When he arrived in WCW the following month, fans hoped he'd get his revenge, a fresh start after the storm. But as Bret later admitted in his autobiography, Hitman, "My real life in the cartoon world of wrestling, the screwjob haunted him. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been erased," he wrote. They rewrote history overnight, and in many ways, they had. Vince McMahon would go on to use Bret's fall as a catalyst for the company's rebirth. The new villainous chairman versus rebellious superstars storylines skyrocketed ratings. Meanwhile, Bret was left in WCW, poorly booked, directionless, and emotionally drained. He once told a friend he felt like a ghost walking through someone else's company. The man once known as the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be, was now struggling to find meaning in a business that had turned its back on him, and yet the worst was still to come. In the coming years, Bret's life would spiral into tragedy after tragedy. A career-ending concussion from Goldberg's infamous kick, the death of his brother Owen Hart during a live WWE event, and a series of health crises that nearly nearly claimed his life. What began as a story about betrayal in the ring was about to become something far darker, a curse that seemed to follow him long after the cameras stopped rolling. But before the fall, the betrayal in Montreal remained the defining moment, the wound that never fully healed. Bret himself once said in a 1998 WCW interview, "Vince didn't just screw me, he screwed the fans, the boys in the back, and the idea of honor in this business." The hitman had walked into Montreal a hero. He walked out of exile. And in that silence, under the fading echo of the crowd, wrestling itself was forever changed. Loss, injury, and the curse of the Harts. The years that followed the Montreal screwjob would push Bret Hart into the darkest chapters of his life. If the betrayal in Montreal had broken his spirit, what came next would break his body, his family, and nearly his will to live. When Bret arrived in WCW in December 1997, fans expected fireworks. He was the man who'd been robbed on live television, the wrestling purist turned avenging hero. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. WCW didn't know what to do with him. There were no major storylines ready, no long-term plans, no emotional payoff for the most infamous moment in wrestling history. Bret had left WWF as its top star, but in WCW, he was treated like just another mid-card talent. He would later say, "I walked into a company that didn't understand me, didn't respect me, and didn't know what they had." The booking was chaotic. Instead of feuding with legends like Sting or Ric Flair, dream matches that fans had waited decades for, Bret was thrown into half-hearted storylines. Behind the scenes, the locker room was divided by politics, creative egos, and executives who cared more about ratings than wrestlers' health. Bret tried to hold on, giving solid matches night after night, but the spark was gone. The man who had once carried the WWF on his back now looked tired, adrift, and disillusioned. Then came December 19th, 1999, Starrcade, Bret Hart versus Goldberg for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. It was supposed to be a redemption arc. Bret, finally getting the recognition he'd been denied in WWF, standing tall as the champion. Instead, it became one of the most devastating moments of his career. Midway through the match, Goldberg went for a mule kick, a move he'd done dozens of times, but this time it landed wrong. His boot connected with the side of Bret's temple at full force. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Bret dropped instantly, dazed, but kept wrestling for another 10 minutes, finishing the match as if nothing had happened. He didn't realize that in that instant, his career had ended.
And then, when Bill Goldberg kicked me in the head and ended my career, it was such a lousy way to go because I didn't know my career was over. And when I did go home, and it took me a year to find out that my career was over.
Medical reports later confirmed that Bret had suffered a grade 3 concussion, the most severe kind, resulting in post-concussion syndrome that would plague him for more than a year. The diagnosis, confirmed by neurologist Dr. Joseph Maroon in Hart vs. WCW 2000, revealed traumatic brain injury consistent with long-term CTE risk, the same type of brain trauma linked to deceased NFL players, according to Maroon affidavit, Hart vs. WCW 2000. Bret described the moment later, saying the pain was like a shotgun blast to the head. In interviews, he confessed to having memory lapses, blurred vision, and deep depression. He would forget simple words, lose track of conversations, and suffer relentless migraines. Just months earlier, on May 23, 1999, while Bret was still in WCW, tragedy struck at home in the most unimaginable way. His younger brother, Owen Hart, fell 78 feet to his death during a live WWF pay-per-view called Over the Edge. Owen was performing as a comedic superhero called the Blue Blazer, descending from the arena rafters on a harness that was supposed to gently lower him into the ring. The harness failed. The quick-release mechanism, later determined to be a cheaply modified sailboat clip, not a professional stunt rig, malfunctioned, releasing Owen mid-descent according to rigging report Delbert Hall 2000. He fell at a speed of 54 miles per hour, hitting the top rope chest first before collapsing lifeless in the ring. The impact caused an aortic rupture, killing him instantly. As the audience screamed in confusion, WWF continued the broadcast. Fans at home had no idea what had just happened. The cameras cut away, commentators spoke in hushed tones, and Bret, hundreds of miles away, sat alone in disbelief as his phone rang. In his 2007 autobiography, Bret wrote, "I dropped the receiver and screamed so loud I thought my lungs would tear. My little brother was gone. He took months away from wrestling, withdrawing from the public eye. The lawsuit lawsuit that followed became one of the most controversial in wrestling history. Owen's widow, Martha Hart, filed a wrongful death suit against WWF, alleging gross negligence for using unsafe equipment and untrained riggers, according to Rob & Rob legal records. The case was settled out of court in 2000 for $18 million, the largest payout in wrestling's history. Part of the settlement required WWE to destroy all footage of the fall, a decision Martha said was necessary to protect Owen's dignity. Bret supported her fully, but no amount of money could erase the image from his mind. In one interview with the Calgary Sun, he said, "I couldn't watch wrestling for a year. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Owen falling." His brother's death was not just a loss, it was an emotional rupture that split the Hart family forever. Some relatives stayed loyal to Vince McMahon for business reasons, while others, including Bret, severed all contact. The once proud wrestling dynasty became fractured beyond repair. By the early 2000s, Bret's life had become a series of quiet declines. His career was gone, his brother was gone. The WWF he'd helped build was now publicly mocking his name on television. Even his health began to collapse. Then in June 2002, disaster struck again. Bret was cycling near his home in Calgary when he lost control and hit a patch of gravel. He fell, smashing the right side of his head on the curb. The next thing he remembered was waking up in a hospital bed, unable to move the left side of his body. He had suffered a massive stroke, the result of a blood clot in the brain's right parietal lobe, according to the Sportster. How Bret Hart suffered a stroke. Doctors weren't sure he'd walk again. For months, he was wheelchair-bound, his speech slurred, his once steady hands trembling uncontrollably. In an interview with 411 Mania, Bret described it as feeling like being cut in half, according to 411 Mania interview. He refused to accept defeat. Through relentless therapy and hyperbaric oxygen treatments, he slowly regained his mobility. By 2003, he was walking again, though the left side of his body would never fully recover. The tremors, headaches, and numbness stayed with him for life. But even as he fought his way back to health, the hits kept coming. His father, Stu Hart, passed away in 2003 from pneumonia. Close friends like Davey Boy Smith and Brian Pillman, both fellow wrestlers from the Hart family circle, had already died from heart attacks linked to drug abuse. As Bret once said in a 2019 interview, 8 of us trained in the dungeon. Only 3 of us are still alive. The pain followed him everywhere. He went through 2 divorces, battled depression, and struggled with insomnia and post-traumatic stress. "I used to dream about Montreal," he told Sports Illustrated in 2017. "I'd wake up sweating, thinking I was still in the ring." Then, just as life seemed to settle, cancer struck. In early 2016, Bret was diagnosed with prostate cancer after his PSA levels spiked to 9.8. The news hit him like another Goldberg kick, sudden, cruel, and unforgiving. He underwent a robotic prostatectomy at Calgary's Rocky View General Hospital on February 18, 2016, removing the cancer before it could spread. The surgery left him weak and battling temporary complications like urinary incontinence and fatigue. But Bret faced it the same way he faced every opponent, with quiet determination. In an interview with CBC, he said, "I thought the stroke was bad, but cancer makes you stare at the Reaper." He survived again. By 2017, his doctors declared him cancer-free, his PSA levels at 0. But beneath the survival stories, the weight of loss was unbearable. He once admitted, "From 1997 to 2003, I lost everything. My job, my brother, my health, my father, my marriage. I don't know how I'm still here." Because for all the pain he endured, Bret Hart wasn't finished. He had one more match to fight, not against an opponent in the ring, but against his own past. Survival and redemption. The story of Bret Hart could have ended with pain, and for a long time it seemed like that's exactly how it would. Betrayal, concussion, loss, stroke, cancer. The man had endured every possible heartbreak life could throw at him. But what truly defines a legend isn't how hard they fall, it's whether they ever stand again. And for Bret, the hitman Hart, redemption came in the most unexpected way, inside the very ring that once broke him. By 2009, the idea of Bret returning to WWE seemed impossible. He had spent over a decade publicly condemning Vince McMahon, calling the company a machine that eats its own. He refused to attend Hall of Fame ceremonies, turned down reunion invitations, and rejected lucrative offers to make cameo appearances. In interviews, he said he still had nightmares about Montreal, the betrayal, the booze, the ringing bell. His health had improved, but his bitterness had not. Fans had accepted that they'd never see him back under the WWE lights. Then, in January 2010, the unthinkable happened. On a cold Monday night, the familiar pink and black theme blasted through the speakers of WWE Raw. The crowd erupted. Bret Hart, older, slower, still bearing the stiffness from his stroke, walked down the ramp for the first time in 12 years. The fans screamed his name, some with tears in their eyes. Bret looked around the arena, visibly emotional. This wasn't about competition anymore. It was about closure. Standing in the ring, face to face with Shawn Michaels, the man who had helped orchestrate his betrayal, Bret took a deep breath. The tension was electric. The world held its breath. And then, in one of the most surreal moments in wrestling history, Bret extended his hand. Shawn looked at him, nodded, and embraced him. The arena exploded in applause. After more than a decade of silence and animosity, Bret Hart forgave the man who had once humiliated him on live television. Later, he said, "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just frees you from it." But the story didn't end there. The following month, Bret confronted Vince McMahon live on air. The same man who had secretly ordered the bell to be rung in Montreal now stood across from his old champion. Bret, visibly emotional, told him, "You screwed me in Montreal, but tonight I'm here to bury the hatchet." McMahon smirked, extended his hand, and, in a twist of poetic irony, kicked Bret below the belt, reigniting their rivalry one last time. It all led to WrestleMania 26 in March 2010. The storyline built around real-life animosity. Bret Hart versus Vince McMahon in a no-holds-barred match. Fans expected something symbolic, and that's exactly what they got. Bret didn't wrestle in the traditional sense. His body couldn't handle it, but he fought with emotion, with every strike carrying the weight of 13 years of bitterness. One by one, members of the Hart family surrounded the ring, trapping McMahon in his own creation. Bret pummeled him with steel chair shots before locking him in the sharpshooter as the crowd roared in approval. Vince McMahon tapped out. In that moment, Bret Hart, the man who had been humiliated, betrayed, and left broken, finally got his revenge. But more importantly, he got his peace. He didn't celebrate or gloat. He simply stood there, arms raised, surrounded by his family, while 70,000 fans in Phoenix chanted his name. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about closure. That same year, he won one final championship, the United States title, defeating The Miz on Raw before vacating it days later. It was more ceremonial than competitive, but symbolically, it was Bret reclaiming his place in the history books. His final in-ring appearance came in 2011 during a WWE UK tour in a lighthearted exhibition match that ended not with a sharpshooter but with a standing ovation. From there, Bret slowly transitioned into a new phase of life, one defined not by titles or rivalries, but by resilience. He became a symbol of survival, a man who had endured more than most and lived to tell the story. In interviews throughout the 2010s, Bret spoke candidly about his health and aging. He admitted that his body still bore the scars, nerve damage from the stroke, chronic headaches from the Goldberg kick, limited mobility in his left hand. Yet his tone wasn't bitter anymore. It was reflective. "I've learned to make peace with my story," he said in a 2017 interview with CBC News. Link. Outside the ring, Bret's focus shifted toward advocacy. He became a vocal supporter for stroke awareness, concussion safety, and cancer prevention. He gave speeches in hospitals, visited rehab centers, and used his fame to raise funds for medical research. To younger wrestlers, he was no longer just the hitman. He was a teacher, a mentor, and a warning about the price of pushing too hard. In 2016, he made another emotional return, this time to WWE's Hall of Fame ceremony, where he stood beside Natalya Neidhart and others to induct his late brother-in-law, Jim the Anvil Neidhart. 2 years later, in 2019, he was inducted again, this time as part of the Hart Foundation, immortalizing his partnership with Neidhart and the legacy of their pink and black brotherhood. During that induction, Bret stood on stage, visibly overwhelmed, when a fan suddenly jumped the barricade and tackled him mid-speech. Security dragged the man away. Bret got up, brushed off his jacket, and finished his sentence as though nothing had happened. The crowd rose to their feet in applause. That moment, calm in chaos, focus amid madness, summed up Bret Hart perfectly. Over the years, he's reflected often on his family's legacy, the Hart dynasty that began with his father Stu's grueling training in the dungeon. So many of them have gone too soon. Owen, Davey Boy Smith, Brian Pillman, Dean Hart, Georgia Hart. He once told an interviewer, "We all paid the price for loving wrestling too much." But his pride in their legacy never faded. Through Natalya, Tyson Kidd, and the next generation of wrestlers influenced by his style, from CM Punk to Bryan Danielson, his DNA lives on inside the ring. By 2025, Bret Hart is 68 years old. He lives quietly in Calgary, running a bar and restaurant called The Heart and Soul, where fans still line up to shake his hand. He's still recognized everywhere he goes, though he says fame doesn't excite him anymore. Peace This excites me, he once said. Quiet mornings, a good cup of coffee, and knowing I'm still here. Physically, he continues to battle the long-term effects of his injuries, post-stroke neuropathy, fatigue, and mild tremors, but his spirit remains sharp. He trains a few times a week with his niece Natalia, maintaining strength and coordination. He's also been collaborating with HBO Canada on a documentary set to release in 2026 titled The Last Heart, chronicling his life's triumphs and tragedies. Even today, wrestling journalists, athletes, and fans continue to debate his legacy. Was he truly the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be? His peers seem to think so. Vince McMahon himself once called Bret the man who carried WWF through its hardest years. Chris Jericho, a fellow Canadian and admirer, said in A Lion's Tale, Bret was the worker's worker, the guy everyone else secretly wanted to be. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.